So I have one big goal tonight. I want to connect you with the land, and I want to use the Native Americans to do it. Now, at the end, I'll ask, did I accomplish my goal? And I want you to be honest. You're not going to hurt my feelings, but I need to know, because if I do this presentation again, I need to modify it, make it right, or keep it like it is. You tell me how we did, okay? All right, so let's get started. I call this the Southeast Story. I am going to work through a lot of different information. I'm going to work through pollen studies. I'm going to work through archaeology, paleontology, geology. I'm going to look at biogeography. I'm going to look at all kinds of climate stuff. And I'm going to pull this all together so that you understand what the Native Americans were doing. When I would go to museums and I would see a display of Native American tech, which was usually rocks or shells, I didn't have a good understanding of what was that attached to. What was that doing? What was it used for? And that's something that I am a much better student of now, studying Native American tech and native plants and animals. So I'm going to take you on a walk through that. Now, if all that sounded just a little bit intimidating, let me take the pressure off. I am going to really make this common shirt sleeve. We're going to get fascinated with it, no big words, or at least not a bunch, and you're going to walk away, I think, going, wow, that was pretty cool. All right, so here's the rundown of what I'm doing. I want you to notice that I have all these different time periods written down. I'm using an archaeologist way to look at time. We're going to start at the Ice Age. We're going to look at the stage of what were we experiencing here in the state, and then we're going to look at what were people doing when they first arrived here. And I want you to notice that there's a blue color on there. All of my slides will be blue. So you'll know when I get into the Archaic because I'm going to get into orange slides. And then I'll get into the Woodland period. And I want you to notice the Woodland and the Ice Age are much smaller than the Archaic. Okay, the Ice Age was much larger, but the part that deals with people is not so long. So that's giving you an idea of what the time periods were, the size. So you've got color to tell you what we're dealing with. We have length to tell you about that. And when you see me get to the white slides about the historic period, you know I'm about to wrap it up. And that means, well, hey, we're getting ready to go home or ask questions or have a blast. Okay. So I want to start with what was it like during that glacial period. And I want you to pay attention to the map. This is a map of Missouri that shows essentially the northern half of the state was covered in a glacier, anywhere from 670 feet tall, which is, I think, double the St. Louis Arch, or as you get further up into North America, some of those sections of the glacier were a mile thick. And believe this or not, glaciers flow like streams of water. They really do, but they're really slow. They're really, really slow, but they move. And by the way, I want you to pay attention here that this is the modern-day boundary of the Missouri River. It is also the extent of that glacier, which tells you why the Missouri River is where it is. And most of the water that fell on the Ozarks at one time, most of it would have flown north up into the Great Lakes, in the Hudson Bay, and out into the Atlantic. And that changed, and I'll explain that. All right, so I want you to pay attention. You got a glacier, and then you have tundra. Now, that's a word that some of you may recognize. If you want to see tundra today, you have a couple different places you could go. You could go to northern Canada and Alaska, and you're going to see a lot of moss, sedges, lichens, and no trees. Everything's very short. If you go to the Rocky Mountain National Park and go to the Alpine Center, has anybody been there? Okay, so that is what you're looking at. Tundra is alpine on a mountain, or it can be up way north around the Arctic Circle. It's very, very conservative. It's a tough place to live. You have muskox up there, snowy owls, lemmings, not lemons. And then if you go a little further south into Missouri, at that time we had something called taiga or boreal forest. If you want to see a forest like that, go into southern Canada, go into Minnesota or Wisconsin. That's what you're going to see up there, where you have a lot of tamarask and things like that. And then if you look down here where we think is the best part of the state, right, in these lowlands, they had kind of a wet version of the boreal forest. And you had a lot of plants in there that are very different. If you talk to a well digger down here, they can tell you about things they have pulled up from their well casings where they have trees that are tamarask, or they have fir trees, or something like that, pine trees that did not exist here ever except during this time period. And it definitely doesn't live here today. So this is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. So I want you to keep in mind it's cold, and it's pretty much like going up into Alaska or Canada. That's what Missouri used to look like. All the plants, all the animals, that's what's here. With addition to a lot of other stuff that we see if we go to museums like woolly mammoth, mastodons, North American camels, North American lions, and we had a lot of stuff. North American horses. We used to have horses until they went extinct, but then they were brought back by the Spanish. So you got all this weird stuff hanging around out here, and at this time, 15,000 years ago, according to archaeologists, we do not have people here to see this. They're in other continents. They're somewhere else. If you get into the literature, you're going to see there's some people that argue about that. I'm playing it conservative, 15,000 years. If you want to get into some of the other theories, you're welcome to do that. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying that they're still disputed. Okay, so things start to change, and it's slow. You've got a mile-thick glacier. That does not go away overnight. It's kind of like cooking your Christmas turkey. You got to let it thaw for a day or two, right? Well, we've got a bigger chunk of ice. It's going to have to thaw for a very long time. As that is happening, you have to keep in mind that some of these habitats are starting to go north. A lot of what we consider oak hickory forest today was down in Mexico. That's a long way down. So it takes a while. This is not like a running thing where the trees are just picking up their roots and going somewhere else. Nuts have to be planted somewhere else. Birds and animals are doing some of this. It's a very slow process. While this is going on, beech trees like you're going to find at Crowley's Ridge or Holly Ridge Conservation Area, or if you go up at Wapiti or some of the places on the Benton Hills, or even up to Trail of Tears State Park, you're going to find beech trees, tulip poplar, and cucumber magnolia. All of those trees are typically what we see in the southeastern United States. This is when they start to move up in here. But here's something else that's a little clue. This gold-striped darter, he lives on Crowley's Ridge, and in Missouri, nowhere else. Only on Crowley's Ridge around all of these beech, tulip, poplar, cucumber, magnolia trees. Now, they live in other parts of the United States, but down where the rest of that forest type is common. And that's how we know this darter came up. We know it came up during that time period, and they're very isolated in Missouri on just Crowley's Ridge. Now, just from a show of hands, how many of y'all know about Crowley's Ridge? I love it. I love it. Y'all are my people. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at some things that happened during this time period. Now, this is fascinating. I'm going to point out a couple of features that haven't developed yet because they're not here. Right here is where Cape Girardeau is going to be built. Right down here is where Dexter is going to be built, and over here is where Poplar Bluff is going to be built. Can you all kind of see that? So this is Crowley's Ridge. This is the Benton Hills. And I want you to understand, this is the Shawnee Hills, and there you can walk all the way from the Shawnee Hills to the Benton Hills, and before all this Ice Age flooding happened, you could walk all the way down into Arkansas and almost get down to Memphis before you actually got your feet wet. Used to be, that was all connected. It was essentially a big levee. Now what happened is, all of that glacier that's up on North Missouri, it's starting to melt, and it can't go where it used to go. Remember the water was going to the Hudson Bay? Can't do that. There's ice in the way. It's a dam. So it's pooling up between the Ozarks and the glacier, and it's trying to find ways to go. And there's this little itty-bitty river. You might have heard of it today. We call it the Mississippi. And the Mississippi at one time ran from Cape Girardeau down through Mingo, and then close to Poplar Bluff, and it went all the way around Crowley's Ridge until it met with the Ohio River close to Memphis, which is not what it does today, but that's what it used to do. Now, I want you to think about this. You've got so much water backing up in there. You go out to Mingo, some of those hills are 90 to 120 feet tall. So you have water backing up all the way up to the top of those hills, and then it starts to trickle over the hills. Now, how many of you have ever seen footage of a levee break? Pretty dramatic, right? So that water goes over and it starts to eat at the levee. The next thing that happens, it starts to make it weak. More water's coming over. Now it's getting turbulent. And when that thing breaks, boom, it just takes over. Now, I want you to understand, as bad as some of those floods and some of the levee breaks we have seen on footage are, they were nothing compared to this. You're looking at a 120-foot tall wall of water ripping and snorting down through this area right through here, which we now call the Little River Basin. That's what happened. That's how that got formed. It's also part of why Mingo is the way it is. Water was backed up there. It didn't drain very well. It actually drained backwards into this area. It went through the Advance and the Bell City Gap to make the drainage that we're used to today. It removed a lot of sand. It removed a lot of gravel. And it left an area that was depressed and appropriate for swamps. And by the way, if you were at the swamp presentation, you know I talked about that, and it was awesome stuff. And if I need to come back down for that, I'd be happy to. All right. So does this make sense, what we're talking about? Everybody kind of get a sense of place and what happens? So we've got a big jump. The river jumps from what I call the western lowland over to the Little River Basin. All right, so that's the first jump. But it's still not where the Mississippi is today. And when this happened, there were no people here, as far as we know. Okay, so here's a little more modern map, and I want to point out to you that up here at Thebes, there is something we call the Thebes Gap, and the Mississippi River really got jammed up down here around Scott City, or what will eventually be Scott City. And then it broke through the Thebes Gap, and then it pirated a channel down to where the Ohio River is, and then over the next 12,000 years, it meandered back and forth all through this area, making oxbow lakes and back channels and bayous and things of that nature. So that's kind of the modern origin of the Mississippi River, but because of all those breaks from the Ice Age flooding, it made new territory that had never been looked upon in Missouri that way ever before. One other thing I want to point out, it's a clue. This is a spring cavefish. Are you all familiar with the cavefish? Typically, they have no pigment. They are white. You can see their organs. You can see their blood vessels. And they have essentially no eyes. And they have little electrosensors. And they are completely adept in complete darkness. Pretty cool fish. Now, this one is a spring cavefish. And I want you to notice, not only does he have pigment, a little bit, but you can still see some of his blood vessels. And he has eyes. He has little eyes in there that do work. There's a population of them right up here on the Benton Hills. And in Missouri, they occur nowhere else. They do occur over here in the Thebes Gap, in the Shawnee Hills, and they occur over in Tennessee and in Kentucky. So how did that little fish get over there? Well, here's the deal. If you look at the genetics on these fish, they are inbred, and they are not the same as the ones across the river from the standpoint of there's no gene flow. They are inbred. The story to tell, when that Mississippi River broke through the Thebes Gap, it marooned all of those spring cavefish on that spot right there. Make sense? That's some of the evidence we use to say, we know what happened here. So I'm setting the stage. And some of you are thinking, I thought you were going to talk about Native Americans. I'm getting there. I'm just about there. Okay, so one last thing about plants and animals. So you've got a lot of things that lived down here that really live in northern climates that are very, very cold, or at least cool by our standards. And these are some of the things that still live here. Now, we have 4 species of sculpins. This one, the mottled sculpin, likes it really cold. It does not like to be in warm water at all whatsoever. These other plants and that 4-toed salamander, if you look at their distribution map across the continent, they are all over Canada, all over northern part of the United States, and then they have little pockets, little round spots that don't connect here in Missouri and Illinois. Why? It's called a refugia. These plants and animals found a spot that was kind of like it was up north. It's not perfect, but they can't leave. They're marooned. They are marooned by habitat and climate, subclimates, in those little pockets in a valley or something like that. So there's lots of stuff that went on in Missouri that started very early on from that Ice Age. Now let's talk about people. So when the people showed up, they already kind of had a big game hunting culture. And they did a lot of their hunting with handheld spears, or they also used atlatls. Or, well, we call them atlatls. What they called them, I don't know. But I can tell you this, it is essentially a giant crochet hook, like this right here. And they would put a big 6-foot-long spear on there and hold it with their fingers. And that's kind of what he's doing here. And when you're ready to throw, you release your pinch. Yeah, okay, I need to watch where I'm aiming, right? Okay, so you're going to be able to launch this spear. And let me tell you, if I launched a spear like this, I might be able to hit a target, and then that spear is going to hit, and then it's going to slump down at about a 45-degree angle. If I use this atlatl, this thing is going to fly into my target and go quite a ways through, especially if it's a living target, and that can go all the way through, or sometimes most of the way through. And let me tell you, it will go through a garage door. Do not ask me how I know that. All right, so these guys, here's what they're hunting. They're hunting big stuff. And we're not talking about rabbits. We're not talking about deer. We're talking about mastodons, mammoths, giant ground sloths, giant bison. This is the kind of stuff that when you harvest one of these, you do not pack it up and take it back to camp. You go back to camp and say, y'all, we're going to the big mastodon. You can't miss him. He's about 1.5 miles down, and the camp's moving down there. So then they spend about a month camped out around there, processing the hide, the meat, the bones, doing what they need to do with it. And then when they get hungry again, they find another one, they harvest it, and then they travel to where that is. So they are backpackers, they are nomads, they are gypsies. They do not carry a bunch of stuff. Anybody in here ever go on a backpacking trip in the mountains or anything? Okay, did you take a bunch of stuff? Did you take more than 50 pounds? No. You do not want a bunch of stuff. And if you can get by with one thing instead of 4, you do. So that's kind of the mentality these people had. And if you look at the stone artifacts they left behind, number one, they all kind of look alike. There's maybe 4 or 5 varieties, and that's about it. They don't have a lot of, you think, well, they don't have enough imagination. Well, yeah, they had a lot of imagination. They didn't have a lot of space. They didn't have a lot of room. They didn't want to carry a lot of weight. And they would use one blade for all kinds of things. One blade might be used to take down a mastodon, and then they use it to butcher it, and then they use it to cut up the hide and scrape it and get rid of the fat and tan it. There's all kinds of things you can do with that one blade. Now, could you make multiple blades that would work better for each task? Absolutely. But they didn't want to carry all that around. Does that make sense? These folks were nomads. They carried their camp with them, and then they would move around to wherever the animals were. So they did a little bit of wild food gathering, but they did not have permanent villages. And it's not as predictable where they camped out, because wherever the animals were, that's where they camped. So it's hard to find Paleo-Indian artifacts from that time period here in southeast Missouri. It's not because they weren't here, it's because they were everywhere and nowhere all at once. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we've got going on. Big game hunters, and they are totally dependent on these big game animals. Their culture is completely dependent on this. Now I want to talk about this a little bit. Anybody recognize this critter without the name? It's on there. It's a giant ground sloth. It is related to the two-toed sloth and the three-toed sloth, and it's also related to the armadillo. Now, I bring that up because this animal actually has body scales in its skin, but it's underneath the hair. So this little dude down here that's got his spear thinks he's going to get some bacon pretty easy. Well, sloth bacon comes at a price. You've got to get in between those dermal bones. And these things are powerful. See those big arms and those big claws? They don't climb trees. They bring trees down to them. They're hungry, salad comes straight to the ground sloth. Does that make sense? Totally amazing. Now, here's the thing about these guys. Just like their cousins, the tree sloths, they don't move terribly fast. So, as a hunter, you look at that and go, there's a lot of meat there, and I've got a good safety quotient. So, they're going to hunt the ground sloths. There was a research project in an area in northern New Mexico. They found a bunch of sloth bones near an area where humans lived. And what they found was a lot of sloth bones at certain levels, and you keep digging, or as you're going up in the strata, still sloth bones. And then somewhere along the way, the sloth bones stop, and they start being filled with other stuff. So what's that tell you? The sloths disappeared. Their gravy train dried up. They were now, here's the thing that you need to keep in mind. With these big animals, they do not breed as quickly as a deer. Deer can give birth to something around 1.5 to 2.5 years old, and then they can keep on reproducing as long as they live, which might be 7.5, 10 years, depending. But if you're looking at a giant ground sloth or a mastodon or a woolly mammoth, they may not give birth till they're 10 years old, maybe older. And then they only have one baby, and then they're going to keep that for a while before they have another one. So they don't reproduce rapid fire. So if you put a lot of hunting pressure on these animals, they don't last long. So here's the thing I want you to keep in mind. So these giant ground sloths, they're a good source of meat. They're easy. They're safe. And then they dry up. So then what do you do when your meal ticket can't be cashed? What do? Well, you go to the next safest and easiest thing to eat. Now, I want you to keep in mind, this is a mastodon that's being hunted, and woolly mammoths are very similar, except that the mastodons, they're a woodland species, their teeth are different, and then the woolly mammoths are a little bigger, and they eat grass by comparison. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. You've got a woolly mammoth, and they have these big tusks, and if one of them were to swing its head back, kind of like it's going to hit you like a golf club, and you're the ball, and you're teed up, it can hit you in the midsection, and if you were to survive that level of impact, what would happen is they would pick you up and start to sling you across the ground, and all of your blood would go to your extremities, which would be your feet and your head. and it goes to your head like that, you're going to have the worst aneurysm of history. Do you think that's a very safe way to hunt? I don't. Also, if you were to see one of these animals put their foot down with the biomechanics, if you take a gallon container of, let's say, a tin can full of tomato sauce or tomatoes that are canned, I could stand on that all day. I could stomp and jump on that, and I'm not going to get that to break. One of these animals could put its foot down and smash that like a watermelon. And the reason I know that is not from personal experience. It's from biomechanical experiments that have been done with their skeletons and understanding their muscles. These guys were powerful, they were faster, and they were dangerous. So you can see the reason you might want to use an atlatl as opposed to a hand spear that you'd run up and stick that animal. Make sense? These folks were not stupid. They were very smart, and they were bringing home the bacon with this for a long time. I want you to keep in mind that gravy train ended too. I want to talk about 2,000 years after man is supposed to have shown up at North America. All of the big Ice Age beasts go extinct. All of them. Now, we still are left with bison, the ones we know, elk, deer, pronghorn, stuff like that. We're left with that, but not the big stuff, not the stuff that you could camp around. Anything you kill that's left, you can drag it back to camp. You could butcher it and 3 or 4 people could bring it back. All right, so I want you to take a look at this. This is not Missouri, but this is a cliff site in one of the Dakotas. I forget if it's North Dakota or South. And what they did is they looked at this and they found that these bison were being run off of a cliff, and they would fall down in this gully, and they were probably using fire, torches, spears, yelling, all kinds of methods to try to herd these animals off the cliff. Now, the animals that went down in there, the top layer would be butchered. If you dig down a little deeper, you find the ones underneath them were not. What does that tell you? There's too many killed. They couldn't make use of them all. You dig down a little further, there's more bison that were butchered. You dig down a little deeper, there's more bison that weren't butchered. And it's like a lasagna of butchered, not butchered, butchered, not butchered. So every time they ran these bison off the cliff, they killed more than they could eat. What does that tell you? It's not a recipe for long-term success, right? All right. So that played out all across North America. Now, there is some discussion and some disagreement about how did all these Ice Age critters die out. A lot of people said, it's getting warmer, the habitat's changing, these animals weren't going to live anyways. When there's others that are going, now wait a minute, this happens in North America, we think people were putting too much pressure on them, but here's what's really interesting to me. That pattern of every 2,000 years after people show up, the big critters die out, same thing happened in Europe, Asia, and Australia. And what's really interesting is the climatic changes were all happening at the same time, but people's arrival did not. So that tells you it's not just the climate, it's the pressure from the hunters. Because they were not conserving, they ended up ruining their culture, and they had to make a shift. Okay, so you notice my slide color changed. Now we're getting into the Archaic, a long time period. And these folks, they had to figure some stuff out, because they don't have mastodons to follow around, so they've got to start figuring it out. It starts to get a little warmer, starts to get a little wetter. Things are starting to become more like what we think Missouri should be. And they used the atlatl. I just showed you that. They had years, thousands of years of using atlatls with banner stones and all kinds of spear points. In fact, most of the spear points that you will find here in southeast Missouri are from the Archaic period. And what I mean most, I'm talking 70 to 80%. A lot of atlatl points, a lot of hunting going on. So let's talk a little more about this. So let's look at the habitat for the early Archaic. Now you remember that map. This is the map I used for the Ice Age, right? All right, so things are starting to get a little warmer, get a little wetter. I want you to pay attention to the map. I'm going to advance it about 5,000 years. And this is what it looks like in the early Archaic. So you see that we've got some prairie in the north and the west. We have some forest all around the Ozarks and even down into the lowlands down here on the fun side of the state, right? So this is the kind of stuff that we recognize. Maple, ash, hickory, oak. That's the kind of stuff that's living here. But what's interesting to me is the ratios are different, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at a lot of what you see in the early Archaic. Although you have all of these species at once, the pollen records tell us that willow, ash, and maple are dominant. And it was that way early on for several hundred years, and all of a sudden, it switched, and it went to oaks and hickories and chinkapins. Why? Well, here's some things about this you need to understand. First of all, those willow, ash, and maple, they can germinate in the shade. They can live in the shade. They can grow up to be a big adult tree in the shade until they make it to the canopy. Oaks, hickories, chinkapins, they cannot. They have to have open habitat. Here's something else we know about those trees. They can tolerate fire. Maple, ash, and willow, nope, not so much. They really don't like that. So, what was happening? People. They were burning the land. They were starting to manage the land. And we think what was going on was they started to realize, if I'm going to hunt and I burn this landscape here, I don't have near as many limbs to have to contend with when I use my atlatl. They also started to figure out, when I burn this patch, I get more blooms on those flowers, and those flowers make more seeds, and if I'm going to gather those to eat, I think I'm going to burn this off periodically. So we think very early on, people were managing the land. Now, I hear people say, well, I think we need to manage the land before people showed up. So your only choice is the Ice Age. Because at this point, people are already having a significant influence on the land. So it's kind of hard to go back to natural before people without having mastodons. And we're just not going to do that. So that makes kind of a hard decision. So when those forests came in, this is the kind of stuff that moved in with those forests, and it's the stuff we expect in an oak hickory forest. We have timber rattlesnakes, spotted salamanders, striped skunks, chipmunks, deer, fox, squirrel, bobcats. If you go into an Ozark forest, it's the same stuff, for the most part. Now down here, we started to get our tupelo, cypress, pumpkin ash, all of that kind of stuff started to come in the areas that were big open cypress lakes, and then these were on the borders, because they could tolerate that extended period of flooding. But they also started to get a lot of the typical bottomland hardwoods like willow oak, water oak, swamp chestnut oak, all those kind of oaks, they were living down there along with. So if we were to be dropped back in time, this would remind us of Mingo or Otter Slough or 10 Mile Pond or Black Island. Everybody with me on that? So it's a long history of having swamps down here. Okay, so what are you going to eat? Well, people had to figure that out. And we started to learn that their camps became seasonal. So they would be in a spot, and they would be there in the summer, and they would fish. They would catch a lot of fish, they would dry them out, smoke them, and they would save that to go all the way through the winter. They would collect hickory nuts, in particular, and in force. Of all the nuts you can collect, and let's ignore walnuts and butternuts because they're big and they're really hard to crack. Of all the nuts you can crack, the hardest one to crack and get the nut meat out of and get much out of it is the hickory nut. Now, we've all cracked a pecan. It's not that difficult. And you get a pretty good, what people used to call a goodie. Pretty good goodie out of there, right? Well, they did eat them, but they ate more hickory nuts. And you got to ask yourself a question. Why would you do that? If they are so hard to crack and they're so small of a reward, why would you do that? Well, it's because it wasn't hard the way they did it. Now, it's hard the way we do it, so I'm going to let you in on a secret. And you can do this, and it works, because this is how I make my hickory nut pies. I will break my hickory nuts into small little pieces. And I'm not talking about something that's the size of a dime. I'm talking about stuff that it's all not powder, but it's pretty small. Shells, nut meats, all mixed together. And then I put it in a pot, and then immediately the nut meat floats, and the shells stay on the bottom. Isn't that cool? Now, if I want the oil in there, I put a little heat on that, and now that starts to bubble up the oil, and what I can do is I can skim off immediately my nut meat, put that in a bowl, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing with that nut oil, which I'm going to skim that off, put it in another bowl, and then I can use that for seasoning. I can use it for hickory lamps, hickory oil lamps. I can also use that for dressing my hair. That would be my conditioner, all right? So that's why hickory was so important to them. But here's the thing. They didn't have pots. They didn't have pottery. Here's how they cooked their food. It's kind of cool. Look at this. All right, see this dude right here? He's got a hole in the ground with leather lining, and he put water down there. So how are you supposed to cook your water like that? Well, this is clever. If you've ever seen Poverty Point pieces, they're clay cooking stones. You take this piece of clay and you fire it. And then after you fired it and let it cool, you now can put that in the fire again and again and again and again. And every time it gets kind of hot or red hot. You take it out with sticks, and you put it in that spot right there where the water is, instant boiling. So then you can put your hickory nuts in there, or you can make your stew or do whatever. That's how they cooked back in the Archaic period. They were doing all kinds of basket making. They were actually making soapstone bowls, but they weren't the type of thing that you're going to do a lot of cooking in. They're not the kind of thing you put in a fire. They're not going to last through that, but they would be great for holding a liquid and letting it dry off. Everybody with me so far? Making sense? Okay. All right, so what are they eating? Well, they're hanging around aquatic areas, because as it turns out, there is more living stuff around a wetland or a river. So you have more plants, you have more animals, and you got more opportunity to eat something. So they said, this is where we're hanging out. Their camps were largely around wet areas. Not in the wet area, but next to it. And so they would eat mussels. Anybody in here ever eat a mussel? Okay, what'd you think? The first one I had, I must have done something wrong. It tasted like mud. How do I know what mud tastes like? Don't talk to me about that. But they ate so much of the stuff, they would have these huge refuse piles that would actually change the soil pH and type. They ate a bunch of mussels, and they ate a lot of fish. You see a lot of fish bones. But they also hunted, so you saw deer bones and turkey bones and rabbit bones and raccoon bones. They ate anything that was down there by the water. And they would net things, they would spear things, they actually poison things. They could take buckeyes, the actual seeds that we have on our red buckeyes, you mash those up into a powder and you sprinkle that out into a stream or a bayou, and the fish kind of get a rotenone feel, and they come up to the top, and you can go out there and just scoop all the fish up you want, cook them up, no ill effects from the buckeye. By the way, that's illegal today. Just want to make sure we clear that up. I don't want any misunderstandings with the local game warden. Whew, man, I'm worried about this crowd. Okay, so here's another thing that I think is pretty fascinating. Agriculture wasn't just born with the burning. The first domestic plant in North America, according to researchers, was the gourd. Now, here's something I think is pretty cool about this. They're from Africa. Now, how did they get over here? I'm going to rule out somebody taking a boat trip to trade over here in North America. I don't think that happened. What they have done is they've taken gourds and they put them in containers with salt water, and they've got them on a slosh so that they're constantly getting wave action and storm action. And you know what? After 120, 150, 180, 200, 250 days, they would pull these things out at regular intervals, break them open, get the seeds, plant them. Now, you started to see fewer and fewer seeds germinate, but by the time you got over a lengthy period, which would be what it would take for one of those gourds to float all the way from Africa over to the Caribbean, and you know what happened? They sprouted. So people started using gourds as one of the first agricultural products here in North America, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so let's talk about the Middle Archaic. Now, here's our map from the early Archaic. Remember, we had prairie in the north and west, had some trees in the Ozarks, and there's still a lot of burning going on. People are living off the land. They've kind of got this now. They've figured out how to move on from the Ice Age. Now, watch the map. We're going to change this up because all of a sudden it starts getting hot. I mean hot. And then it gets dry. And then it looks like this. And this is something that's called a hypsothermal. That's one big word. I told you I wouldn't do a lot of them. And this is a thing that happens in our climate from time to time. There's a history of this through thousands of years. This happened for several thousand years. And it made a prairie from Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up through Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, into Illinois. It was called the Prairie Peninsula. Now, I want you to notice that prairie got into all parts of our state, even down here into the Sykeston Sand Ridge and our wonderful Malden Sand Ridge. So if you have heard about the Malden Prairie, that's when the Malden Prairie got here. I would say the swamp down here in the lowlands was probably so dry, some of it would have been prairie in some spots. So it made for connections to our sand ridges and allowed that stuff to grow. So what comes in? Well, you're familiar with some of the stuff. Prickly pear cactus, in the Ozarks, spotted skunks, in the northern part of Missouri, Topeka shiners, striped scorpions. I used to have those as a kid in Cape County. Today, I couldn't find a striped scorpion in Cape County to save my life, but they were there, and that's how they got there. Badgers, today down here, I know that you have badgers down here because one of our agents, Eric Hiring, he showed me a video of 4 of them he got, and boy, are they cranky. I think they're born cranky. And then when they're caged, it just gets better. We had bison down here, by the way. They were on the sand prairies. They were in the cane breaks. And this was one of the last places in Missouri to still have bison before they were extirpated. Extirpated means they don't live here anymore. They got evicted. All right, so let's take a look at the late Archaic period. You got the map there. You see what it was like in the middle Archaic. It was hot and dry. We got all that prairie. Well, things started to moderate a little bit. It started to cool down a little bit. Started to rain a little more. Next thing you know, we now have a Missouri that for the most part looks pretty close to the way we think of it, except that it was a much more open forest, at least up on the hills. Now down around the lakes and the rivers, still a pretty closed forest. And this is when shortleaf pine moves in. So at this point in time, Missouri has the plants and animals we're used to. Everybody with me on that? And people are still making a living off the land just like they were from the time the Ice Age ended to this point. That's several thousand years of bringing home the bacon with an atlatl and basically doing a little bit of agriculture and a whole lot of hunting and gathering. Okay, now we're changing the color again. We're moving into a new time period. This is the Woodland period. Now they do something radically different. Before they were doing seasonal camps, and you might have 4 or 5 camps you go to throughout the year. In the Woodland period, they said, you know what? We're staying right here. And we are going to do something that we've never done. We are going to raise crops. We are going to make pottery. They discovered all of these kind of things all at the same time. And let me talk about that a little bit more. So things are pretty much like they were in the late Archaic, maybe just a little wetter, a little drier and a little bit warmer. But for the most part, it's going to seem like Missouri. Summers are going to be hot and humid. Winters are going to be cold. That's how it works. All right, so this is when the bow is developed. Now, most of us are very familiar with that. About 2,000 years ago, archaeologists are convinced bows were on the scene, but don't feel bad for the atlatl. It was still being used. It just wasn't being used for everything that you would hunt. So the bow might be used for some of your smaller game, and the atlatl would have been for the bigger game, like an elk or a bison or something like that. Now, they made pottery, and I want to talk to you about the pottery. It's fascinating what happens next, but you have to understand what they did now to understand what they did next. So these pots, they would mix the clay with sand, and that sand is in there to temper the pottery as it's being baked, and that way it cooks evenly all the way through. Works great, with one exception, in my opinion. The pots are not waterproof. So you pour water in a sand-tempered pot, it will start weeping and seeping, and it will leak. So if you have to keep water in there or cook in that pot, you have to oil it. You have to oil it so that it doesn't leak or weep. But this is the beginning of agriculture. You can stay in one spot. Now, I'm not saying they might not send a group of people out to go get something somewhere and then come back weeks later, but they are not, as a group, migrating around from camp to camp to camp. And they did something else. They started to make mounds. They started to build mounds. Now, some of you here, how many of you are familiar with mound builders in this area? Okay, I'm going to talk more about that, but this is where it got started, at least here in Missouri. So let's talk about the ag. Here's what they were raising. Now, this is full-blown agriculture. They are eating sunflower, sumpweed, marsh elder, knotweed, goosefoot, maygrass, little barley, black nightshade. They're still doing gourds, and they're also doing squash. Now, does anybody in here recognize any of those plant names up there besides the squash and the gourds? Sunflowers, okay. Any farmers in here? Okay, farmers will recognize about half of those plants as agricultural weeds. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff in it. Now, some of these, like the maygrass and little barley, those are grasses. We don't see as many of those as we used to, but the black nightshade, I guarantee you, if that's in a field, farmer doesn't want that. But that was something they did eat back then, and a lot of these plants have really good nutrition, and they are loaded with protein. Anybody hear about quinoa? Okay, that seed is related to marsh elder. It's just from South America instead of North America. Did I say that word right? Quinoa? It's not spelled the way it sounds. Okay. Now I want to talk about the Mississippian period, because the Mississippian period is when the people of the Woodland, somebody said, here, hold my Mountain Dew. Whatever y'all are doing, I'm going to do it better. And that's what the Mississippians did. So if they were building mounds, they built bigger mounds in the Mississippian period. If you made art, they made better art. They made bigger, more complicated, more amazing, more beautiful. They made amazing stuff. If you go over to this table, I have a variety of things that I have made as replicas, or in the case of the basket, I have traded for. These are things they were making in the Mississippian period. And they were doing amazing stuff. Now I want to point out these plates. You notice where they came from? Malden. I have replicas of these plates down here. You're welcome to look at those. I also have some books that reference this stuff. There was a cache of these that was found in a farmer's field, and I have to be honest, I don't really know why those were there, but most of them had falcon motifs. That was a big deal to the Mississippian people. And here's how these work. You have to get copper, and copper has to come from the Great Lakes. So they had a big trade network. And they would make all kinds of stuff with this copper. Sometimes they made axe blades, or they would make pendants or ear spools. But when they made these plates, they took that nugget and they started pounding it with a rock. It's the opposite of the way we forge metal. We stick something in a fire, wait till it gets orange, and then we take it out and we hammer it until it starts to get cool, and then we stick it back in the fire, right? They did it the opposite. If it was cool and cold, they would hammer on it until it started to get hard and brittle. Then they would stick it back in the fire, turn it cherry red, and that anneals it. Then they would take a stick, pull that back out of the fire, let it cool off. When it's cool to the touch, you start hammering on it again. So you take this nugget and you pound it down into a sheet of copper. And then you start using sticks and leather, and you're going to emboss these designs on there. And then when you're done, you take a piece of flint and you cut out the margins, you make the shape, and that's how they made these Malden plates. In the archaeological world, this is a big deal. Everybody who knows anything about copper plates has heard of the Malden plates because it was one of the largest, most intact caches of copper. I think these were probably made in Cahokia and were going downriver or down to Arkansas to other mound building sites as trade items. That's what I think was happening. There was a big copper workshop up at Cahokia. Okay, I'm going to read this. This is something I read in a book about mound builders. Keep in mind, I am a conservationist. I'm a biologist. So I'm always looking at things from the eye of native plants and animals and ecosystems. And here's what this guy has to say. Even in central Mississippi Valley, where great amounts of maize were grown, the principal settlements were located right next to large backwater lakes and swamps. The central role of wetlands and development of chiefdoms deserves more attention than it has received. When you look at the Mississippian period, they were growing maize. They were the first ones to grow maize in this area. I'm not saying they originated, I'm saying they were the first ones to adopt it and start using it. But he's saying, as amazing as, see what I did? Amazing? You're going to get that when you go home. Okay, so it's amazing that they had this crop and it was so important to them, but as it turned out, it was where they were located that was so important. They were next to a swamp, because that was their interstate highway, and they were still making a living on all those mussels and all those fish and all those ducks and all those deer and raccoons and possums. All of that was so abundant in this area that this is where the mound building villages were. So I want you to take a look at this map. Everywhere you see a triangle was a mound building village. Some of them were larger, some of them were smaller. Now take a look at that. Just absorb that. You've got a few up here at the top of the Malden Sand Ridge. And by the way, this Rich Woods site, that drawing is based off of this site right here. Now, when you get into one of those sites, you have a place for chunky, you have marker mounds, you have a flat top mound. If you have a flat top mound, somebody lived on that mound. And I'm not saying you wouldn't have burials under some of these mounds. That might be how they start, but when they get to be flat, there's a potentate living there. That's where the chief or somebody who's an organizer or somebody who's important lives on that mound. Now look at how many of these there are. You're looking at very large areas, and I'm going to prove it to you that these were large because of the number of mounds and the number of people. You're looking at a metropolitan complex with a huge agricultural center all around all of these. Big, big deal. And there was trade all up and down the Mississippi River. And a lot of people were going to Cahokia, but they were also going down south to other mound building sites. Now, I want you to look at this graph. I'm essentially just saying mound count. I'm not talking anything about number or size. When I say number, like cubic feet or something like that, I'm just talking about the number of mounds in that city. Now what I have done is I have changed the colors. The red ones are Missouri, the blue ones are not, because Missouri is the place we all care about, right? Because it's awesome. All right, so look at Cahokia, 120 mounds. There is no other mound building site in North America that has more mounds, also no place that has bigger mounds, than what you're going to find at Cahokia, which is an archaeological park you can go to today. Now, the next place I want to point out to you is Moundville, Alabama. Has anybody been there? It's a neat place. If you get a chance to go, it is neat. And they will tout that as the second largest mound building village in North America. What they really mean is it's the second largest remaining mound building village in North America, because I want you to notice that we have 5 other mound building civilizations next in line before Moundville. And I want you to notice that 3 of them were here, not just in Missouri, but southeast Missouri. That Richwood site that we had the picture of was the 4th largest mound building civilization in North America. I think that's pretty cool. Now I want you to also notice that East St. Louis and St. Louis there. So you've got, let me spell this out. So you got Cahokia, and I'm going to do this in reverse. You got Cahokia, and then you've got East St. Louis, and then you've got where the St. Louis Arch is, you've got this St. Louis group right across the river. So you've got this big metropolitan complex, then you've got a sizable metropolitan complex, and across the river you have another metropolitan complex. So it's kind of interesting to me that 1,000 years ago, there was this huge metroplex right where the huge metroplex of St. Louis is. Isn't that amazing? And if you look down here in southeast Missouri, it was a metroplex too. Maybe not quite as big, but it was impactful. It was not sparsely populated, it was densely populated. Isn't that cool? I think it is. And then if you're familiar with over in East Prairie, Towasagi is on this list. So just think about that for a minute. All these mound building civilizations in southeast Missouri were pretty significant, and they contributed to the larger Mississippian culture that was in the Mississippi Valley. Pretty cool stuff. So what were they doing in the Mississippian time? Raising maize. They also had beans. They continued with squash. The other stuff that they were using, they still used it, but they weren't using it as a domesticated crop. And let me explain that. When in the woodland period, they were using that sumpweed, marsh elder, sunflowers, and all that, and they were domesticated. How do they know those plants were domesticated in the woodland period, but not in the Mississippian period? Well, here's how they did it. When those seeds were cooked, some of them would fall out. Anybody here a messy cook? Okay, they had messy cooks 1,000 years ago, several thousand years ago. And they would have stuff get out of the pot, get out of the bowl, and it would go into the fire and get charred, and then it was not going to rot. Now here's the interesting part of that. As an archaeologist, they do seed floats where they try to identify seeds in a burn mound or a burn pit. And what they will do is sift out the seeds, and then they measure them and they figure out what they are. What they found was all of the seeds in the Archaic period of those plants that they were eating were the same size and shape of the plants that they are today. Same thing in the Mississippian period, but during the woodland period, the seeds are bigger. What happens when you domesticate plants? The seeds get bigger because you select for seed size. So they had domesticated plants in the woodland period. Anybody who wants to say Native Americans weren't very smart, I want to just show all of this. They were amazing. They figured so much stuff out. They developed things independent of anybody else, and they made amazing strides in technology and so many different fields. Now, when they made their pottery, here's a shift. In the Mississippian period, they would use mussel shells. They would take a mussel shell, because they ate a bunch of them. They would throw them in the fire. They would delaminate into these small sheets, and they'd grind that up. They would put that in the clay, and then they would cook the clay. And then, when you got your pot and you poured water in it, it held the water. No oiling. How did they figure that out? I have no idea, but they did. And I think that's pretty cool. So they were still hunting. They were mostly using the bow, but they were still using the atlatl from time to time. Now this is a drawing of Cahokia. I didn't do this one, but I do want to point out some things about it. First of all, to be a civilization, there's a lot of things you have to have. One of them is written language, which to our understanding they didn't have written language, but they did have a system of knotting strings and beads to keep records. and that's something that's been found recently. I want to point out some things about this city. So if you go to Cahokia, you're going to find Monk's Mound, which is the largest mound. I mean, it's huge. If you walk all the way to the top of that at a good clip, you're going to be out of breath when you get to the top. I'm speaking from experience. It's a huge mound. That's where the biggest chief of all was living up here. You have other platform mounds. And what's interesting to me, out of 120 mounds, 119 of them are all lined up with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, perfectly. There's only one mound, and that's down here, that's Rattlesnake Mound, and that one is at a 45-degree angle to the cardinal directions. And they had another wood hinge down there that they used to do a lot of their agricultural ceremonies, marking where the moon and the sun were intersecting. Over here, you see that circle? That's all a bunch of trees that have been cut down. They burned the ends so they wouldn't rot, put them in the ground, and they made a wood hinge so they could mark lunar and solar things that were going on. They had a palisade. They had defense. They had an urban center where people lived and probably did a lot of sale of goods. They had recreation areas. This is where they played chunky and stickball. They would do borrow pits. When they filled with water, they raised catfish. This out here is the suburbs. Up here, this is where they had farm fields. This is the interstate highway right here where all the canoes are going to be. And then you're going to have rural places out and about. These folks were less and less inclined to be in the city. 20,000 people living there, and I want you to really wrap your head around this. At the same time in history, Cahokia had more people than London. Let me say that again. Cahokia, at this time in history, had more people than London did at the exact same time in history. Isn't that amazing? Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the consequences of having a really big village like this. We're going to talk about heating and cooking. We're just going to pretend that that's the only thing people use trees for, but we know that they use them for making bows, arrows, paddles, canoes, house posts, all kinds of stuff. But we're just going to talk about the tree tops because those are crooked and they're not real good for some things. So we're going to chop those up and we're going to use those to heat and cook our houses. So you got 20,000 people. We're going to do a little bit of math. Don't stress out. It's okay. We're going to get through this. All right, so we're going to have a family of 4 and they're going to use 1.5 tree tops per year. That's somebody who kind of makes a campfire, you cook on it, and you start figuring out how many campfires do you have to have per day for 365 days. It's 1.5 tree tops. This has been measured out by a scientist. I don't know if that really gives you a lot of confidence, but I trust it. Okay, so 20,000 people, we're going to need about 5,000 fires to heat and cook. That's a lot of fires. That's a lot of smoke. You walk into Cahokia, it's going to smell like smoke all the time. Now, that means that in 1 year, you have to have a total of 7,500 tree tops every year just for that city to cook and heat. I'm not talking about all the other stuff they make out of wood. I'm just talking about heating and cooking. So this equals about 22 tree tops in that city have to be brought in every single day. They're not in the city. They're outside the city. And the more they cut, the further they had to go to get more tree tops. So, in 200 years, that is 1.5 million tree tops that have to be brought into Cahokia for cooking and heating. That's about 8,000 football fields, but it's 13 square miles. If you've ever been to Cape and Jackson, the conglomerate of Cape and Jackson city limits is approximately 13 miles. So, it would be like you being somewhere, let's say you're at, I'm trying to find some place that's real central. Let's say you're at the Cape Nature Center. Gosh, what a marvelous place to be. You now have to walk approximately 7 miles to go get firewood. Because the city takes up an area that has no trees, and then you have to go to an area where the trees are or were to get more firewood. Does that make sense? That's a lot of firewood, and it's got to go a long distance. Are you starting to see a problem here? Now keep in mind the Cahokians had a reach. There are things found at Cahokia, not just as copper from the Great Lakes. They had cannel coal from the North Dakota. They had obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. They had whelk shells, which I have some examples of their art. That came from Florida, from the Calusa people. They had mica from the Appalachian Mountains. They had all kinds of stuff from the Ozarks, all kinds of rocks. But one of them, I want to spend just a quick minute on this. There was a war club found that had shark teeth on it. 4 shark teeth and 1 piece of flint that was napped out to look like a shark tooth. So imagine 4 with 1 on the tip. Pretty good size, nasty piece of work, not for your friends. This is nasty. It's big, and somebody that found this said, we need to figure out more about this, so they took it to a shark expert. The shark expert said, well, first of all, this is a great white shark, and what I mean by that is it's 4 great white sharks because it's the same tooth from 4 different sharks. Every tooth in a shark's mouth is different as you go from the top all the way to the back or the bottom. All of them are different, and shark biologists can tell you which tooth in a species of shark that is. So it was 4 sharks, 4 of the same teeth from those 4 sharks, but here's what really blew my mind. He then followed up to say they were all alive when they were harvested. Think about that for a minute. Dugout canoes on the Atlantic Ocean hunting giant white sharks. And you're going to haul them to the shore, yank their teeth out, and make a war club? Respect. I'm telling you, that is awesome. Okay, so let's talk about one more thing. They can look at where the houses were, and the post holes stain the soil as they rot. It makes a different soil conglomerate. So they know what the size is, they know about the carbon dates, and what they're able to do is say, you know, we look at these houses when Cahokia was first founded, and they used some of the biggest trees they could possibly haul to make these homes. They were sturdy, stout, rugged. And then, about the time that Cahokia peaks, like you've got 20,000 people in this city, it's awesome, people are doing amazing stuff, but the house pole sizes are what I would call medium-sized. And then when you get to the point where Cahokia is about to fall, and it did, they were using the smallest tree size possible to make a house and still make it sturdy. Why is that? Why would they do that? Because they had to travel those trees for so long, it wasn't economical or feasible. So then you went from a thriving metropolitan complex in 1150. By about 1300 or 1350 AD, it was abandoned. In fact, a lot of our Mississippian villages down here in southeast Missouri were abandoned. Let me qualify what I mean by that. They weren't living in the city. They moved out. They were still in the area, but they weren't in the city. Consequences. Their society was not very complex. It's more like the tribes that we met, and I say we, Europeans, met when they showed up on the continent. Not nearly as complex, not saying they're not smart, I'm not saying they're not accomplished, but there is something about a very large, complex society that allows you to do things you cannot do with a smaller group of people. Does that make sense? Give me some feedback here. All right. There you go. I just want to make sure you're all awake. All right, so I want to talk about one more thing before I jump into the historic era. Before Columbus showed up, bison and elk were restricted into an area of the Great Plains that was hostile. When I mean hostile, I mean hot, dry, not a lot of water. You do not, as a human, want to be out there. You're going to have a hard time. So nobody really went out there to hunt bison and elk. That's where you find the bones. That's where you find most of the big animals, but the rest of North America didn't have that. Now, I can tell you that these animals at one time used to be all over the continent, then they were restricted, and then they magically exploded back across the continent. What happened? Well, here's what happened. When Europeans showed up, they had with them, unbeknownst, they had a bunch of diseases. Some of them were pretty innocuous by our standards, like influenza. Anybody get scared of influenza? Maybe a little. I don't enjoy it, but I survive it, and I live to get it again. But they also had the plague. They had typhoid. They had measles. And the Native Americans had zero resistance to this. And a lot of archaeologists have estimated that 90% of Native Americans wiped out before Europeans could ever see them. Because what happened is they would infect a village without meaning to, and then everybody's dying, getting sick, and somebody says, I don't have it, I'm getting out of here. So he goes to another village. Well, he did have it. And he infected the next village. And the same scene replayed itself over and over and over again until 90% of the Native Americans are gone. So what does that do to the pressure that's being put on all these big animals, the bison and the elk? Takes off the pressure. They explode across the continent. They end up from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They get all the way up to almost Alaska and down into Mexico. And that is what Europeans saw when they showed up and said, it's a wildlife paradise, without any knowledge of the fact that they helped create it by the tragedy that came with them. Oh, by the way, cane brakes. If you've ever heard of a cane brake, it is a solid planting of nothing but river cane. 20 feet tall, 300, 400, 500 acres. That used to be a field tended by Native Americans until they wiped out. And then when the Missouri surveyors came along from the 1820s to the 1850s, they would come along and say, an enormous cane brake, difficult to get through, and they would tell you the size, and it would be hundreds, if not thousands of acres of cane. Amazing stuff. So then we had tribes, and they were occupying a lot of different places. Now I have a map up here. In southeast Missouri, that map looks a little different depending on who you talk to. Like if you talk to the Osage, who still, the Osage did not have peaceful relations with anyone. And they were proud of it. And I asked them one time, did you trade with your neighbors? They said, we didn't trade with our neighbors, we killed them. So when they see a map like this, they say, Chickasaw didn't own that, we did. If we saw them there, we'd kill them. And they did. But the Chickasaw would go in there and they'd hunt and they'd fish. So would the Quapaw, which were mainly down in Arkansas. So would the Illini. Everybody kind of claimed this area, but when you look at maps, you're going to see different maps based on people's understanding of what they're hearing from different tribes or archaeology and things like that. Now, if you think I was hard on the Native Americans about getting rid of the Ice Age beast and getting rid of all their timber, hold up. Europeans get their time. This is why I want to talk about them. I want to make this statement. People are people. I don't care who you are. We all have a lot in common. No matter where your ancestors come from, whether it's North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, South America, it doesn't matter. We are people and we have the same tendencies. Now, what they did when they showed up is they began to utilize the resources. And when they got geared up, it only took them about 20 to 25 years to totally get rid of most of the timber in the Ozarks. 20 to 25 years. Does that sound familiar, taking too much timber? It should. It's been done before by people in the Mississippian era. So the Ozarks, the orders that I saw in some of these big sawmills were take every stick of lumber you can get. Those were the directions to the sawyers. Reason? We're not coming back. Period. They weren't going to cut there 10 years later. They were going to take everything from the big stuff all the way down to the smallest stuff they could take. What was left, they'd burn it off, try to graze it. If they tried to farm it, it didn't work really well. The dirt would wash off the hills. So would the rocks. If you were to go into a stream 200 years ago, they were full of cobble and sand. If you go into a stream today in the Ozarks, what are you going to find? Gravel. Everywhere. There are places that people have told me they got baptized in that stream, and I guarantee you, you can't get knee deep in the water in that same spot because it's full of gravel. That is because of the way we did the timber harvest in Missouri. In the Bootheel, we did some of the same stuff. We took every tree we could, but the difference is we were able to do successful farming down here. When you combine drainage with the good soil, we were able to do some pretty awesome farming. But they were able to get some really big trees. But the thing is, if you look at the towns down here, if you look at when towns were incorporated, it was beginning in the 1870s, 1880s. There's a spike, and then about 1890, that's about the most amount of towns we're going to get in southeast Missouri. And then after we drain it and we remove the trees, the incorporated towns and post office started dropping off, and by the time you hit 1940, most of your towns are gone. The logging culture is gone. The market hunting culture, this is how they fed the nation. People stopped using their own farm goods, and they started to rely on someone to go out and hunt bear and ducks and deer and then ship them to the cities. Well, that worked well in the East Coast until they shot too many animals. And then they moved into the Pennsylvania area and the Appalachians. Well, that lasted for a while. Then they had to go into the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley. Then they had to go out to the western part of the U.S. And by the time they had gone all the way through there, they had eliminated so many animals, it's unbelievable. We had lost so many species, almost lost some, and we did lose some, like the Carolina parakeet, the passenger pigeon, the Bachman sparrow, the ivory-billed woodpecker, and the Eskimo curlew. We lost these animals. They're not coming back, folks. They're not living somewhere in the Bahamas waiting to come back. They're extinct. And I think that's kind of sad, especially with that parakeet. Now, there's one other thing that was kind of different. We did change up the drainage down here. It used to be that we had slow-moving water, and if you liked current, there were not a lot of fish down here that liked current. There were a few, but not many, because there wasn't a lot of current down here. If you liked open water, you had quite a bit of opportunity as a fish. And then if you liked rafts. Now, what I mean by a raft is what we would call a log jam, except put it on steroids. Huge, like 100 acres worth of floating logs. That is what they were dealing with. And those fish would live in amongst that, and they loved it. So did fish that liked vegetation. But when we drained it, everything flipped. So if you liked current, woohoo, times are good. If, however, you liked open water, not so much. It's gone. Raft species decrease, veg species decrease. So if you look at our list of endangered and threatened species, it's the ones that like the stuff that's not here anymore. We lost a lot of stuff, and I want to point out there are still some things that we see today. Has anybody here heard of red oak decline? It's not as common as we talk about maybe up in the Ozarks. It comes from, you cut a bunch of trees down, and then what grows back is the red oaks, and they're all the same age. And then when they get to 90 or 100 years old, that's geriatric for a red oak tree. Then they start to die. Well, you've got a whole forest full of 90, 100-year-old trees, and then you got to start over again. And that's because of what happened in the Ozarks 100 years prior. So we're dealing with that. We deal with extinct species. There are some things that had an ecological role that is nothing is performing that function anymore. And there's a lot of stuff now that if you have eyes to see it, it's there. Things have changed. All right, now I don't want to point out that everything's bad. I'm just saying that people have been living off the land, and you can have good positive effects and you can have negative effects. I want to talk about two that I am proud of because I get to benefit from it, and I'm not just talking about my job. I'm talking about I get to deer hunt. I get to go out and get animals to trap. That's amazing for me. I get to go fishing because in 1937, people looked around and said, what have we done? We've cut every stick of timber. We've killed every deer. We've killed every turkey. We don't have any fish in the stream. We cannot do this. We need to come up with an agency that will show us the way to not do this again and fix it. And that's what they did in 1937. And they didn't just do it. They did it with the largest vote for any kind of amendment to the Missouri Constitution in history. That tells me Missourians were proud of their resources, and they wanted them back, and they wanted to keep them and take care of them, and so they could still use them well into the future. And then in 1976, we voted in a sales tax to take care of not just the stuff we hunt and fish, but the entire habitats. And now some of the places that you get to enjoy and we get to enjoy, like Black Island, Otter Slough, Mingo. Now, yes, Mingo is part of that because of the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson funds. Those are excise tax that hunters and anglers said, pick us, use our gear to tax, and we will pay for all this restoration. Now, I'm kind of impressed by that. I didn't vote for it because I wasn't old enough. But that's pretty cool that the state of Missouri, and also of any tax that has ever passed in Missouri, that tax passed with the highest margin of voters. I think that's pretty cool. All right, one last thing. I'm getting close to wrapping it up here. I want to point out that there are a lot of species that visit Missouri and then go back to where they came from. Snowy owls, they come down here in the winter. They'll stay for maybe a month or three, and then they head back north. We get swallow-tailed kites. They come in, they hang around for a few weeks, they go back down to the southeast part of the United States. But there are some species from the desert southwest that are showing up, and they're staying. Scissor-tailed flycatchers, white-winged doves, roadrunners, painted buntings, armadillos. Armadillos have not been here for more than maybe 80 to 90 years. Started coming in the 1940s. What also came here in the 1940s was cattle egrets. Now, what's interesting about the 1940s is when there was this mid-Atlantic pulse. You've heard of El Nino. Well, this is the Atlantic's version, but it's not nearly as simple. And what it does is it brings us more hurricanes, but it also brings us more warmth and drier climate in the Midwest and Mississippi Valley. And that's been going on since the 1940s. Now, I am not here to tell you why. I think you can see for the last 12,000 years, our state has had all kinds of climate fluctuation. I would not argue that humans had something to do with it. So I'm not here to tell you why this is happening. What I'm here to tell you is it's happening. I can't deny the fact that it's happening. Is it happening due to natural stuff? Possibly. It's happened before. It could happen again. There are other things that are going on from a conservation standpoint. We are still having impacts on the land. Urban wildlife conflicts. I get so many calls from people that do not know what to do with a squirrel eating their porch or getting into their bird feeder. And I'm not making fun of them. It's just that's one of the issues. That's a bigger issue now, and nobody used to call for that kind of stuff. Now they do. We have lost connectivity. If something happens to a population of fish at Otter Slough, they're not connected to Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. They could live there, but they can't get there. We have a problem keeping species like prairie chickens. They need big swaths of habitat, and we're having trouble keeping them. Satisfying public demand. Duck Creek Conservation Area is everybody's playground. Everybody wants to go there to do something different. And sometimes it's hard to get that demand spread around. And then there are some people that look at certain things. They'll say, oh, I don't like that species. I don't like that animal. I don't like that plant. Even though everything has a value if you understand it. So these are the kind of things that are going on. And here's one that I want to point out that I think is one of the biggest issues. We have a decline. It's a gradual decline of hunting, fishing, and trapping. Now, first of all, that's a problem because that's one of our very legitimate ways to manage wildlife populations. We have more raccoons than we've ever had because we don't have as many people trapping raccoons. Also, second reason, these are the people that pay the lion's share of managing wildlife habitat for public land and bringing these species back and breeding programs and things like that. I love to bird watch, but as a bird watcher, I'm not paying near as much as I am as a hunter and an angler. And I'm willing to pay that because I like to see the fruits of my labor. I like to be able to go to a place like 10 Mile Pond and see all the waterfowl there. I know people that love to hunt there, and I'm glad they have an opportunity to do that. All right, so there's a lot more to write, is what I'm trying to say. Missouri is going to continue to have stories of what's going on with the biogeography, the climate, the animals, the plants, and more importantly, how people live off the land. Nothing has changed in 15,000 years. We still live off the land. The difference is, right now in this last couple of centuries, you can eat something and never have harvested, processed, or cooked it. You can live in a house that you did not cut the trees, you did not process them, you did not build the house, somebody else did it all for you. Or somebody did bits of it for you. It's all divided up into parcels. And I'm not saying that's bad, but the one downside to that is we don't realize we still live off the land. And our story is still being told. And I think that's pretty important. So here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to connect you with the land. I wanted you to see how Native Americans did it. They did it in a way that was so rich and amazing, and they made a living in ways that I would consider difficult. And they also did it in ways that I think is profoundly genius. Now, we do some pretty genius things today. I love porcelain. I love penicillin. We do some things now that make our lives so much easier. When I'm sleeping at night under that air conditioning, I'm loving it. I'm not trading that back in. I love a hamburger. I love this kind of stuff. But I need to remember that I'm living off the land, just like all of us. So I hope that I have given you some food for thought to say, are you connected with the land? Are you excited about your connection with the land? Are you connected to the Native Americans? Do you see what they did? Do you see what our ancestors did? Are you proud of it? Do you see where we could learn from them? Did I? Did I convince you of that? Did I connect you with the land? Getting a few nods. That's encouraging. Thank you. Thank you for that. This all makes sense? 12,000 years in an hour? Was that a good trip? Was that worth your time? Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you so much.